Return of the Exiled, or Why Must I Be the Hero? By T.J. Stegaheis. Read by YOB. Dedicated to Kurt Raymert, whose stories inspired this work. Requiescat in pace. Chapter 12. Windy, Gorvel City. The wizened old gnome sneered down at Cilio.
So, you little quip, you have broken our most sacred rules and brought humans to our last hope of self-respect. Then, like some foolish bird, you have asked me to give you an army. How many pieces would you like me to cut you into? 10 or 12, you generalship, grinned Cilio. I do have a plan. And why should your plan work when the plans of generations of gnomes have failed? Returned the old gnome. I have timing on my side, said Cilio merrily.
The group had been intercepted by a few dozen well-armed gnomes and ushered into a rough audience hall in the underground warren of caves that was the gnomish sanctuary. Cilio had insisted that they play it straightforward when dealing with the leader of the sanctuary, whatever that meant.
So they are going to just give us a city and generalship in citizenship, and everyone will pretend that things are just as they were 1,000 years ago, continued the old gnome. What happens when they sober up? 1,535 years ago, corrected Filio.
General Abercon glared at him.
It's not like that, said Cilio. The vampire has eliminated the former population of Gorvel City. Even if the king is able to root him out, the city is empty now and vulnerable to being taken over by robber bands, scrolls, and of course more undead powers. But if we can defeat the vampire and we take Gorvel City as our own, the city will have its defenders, and King Mathrin will have gnomish soldiers to flesh out his armies. Think of it, a city of our own. Yes, our king would have to owe fealty to King Mathrin, but where are our cities now? To whom do we turn for justice? We have no home of our own. We receive no justice. Half a meat pie is better than no meat pie.
Oh, yes, said General Abercon, the leader of the gnomish hideaway.
We bop the vampire and take his city and sit down to parley with King Mathrin, get our best deal, join our soldiers to his, and expect to survive, and we keep the city. Is that right?
His voice was soaked in sarcasm.
I'll take point, said Cilio.
That sounds good to me, said the old gnome in a dramatic change of tone. I dream of going out in a blaze of glory, my body riddled with arrows and slingstones. You have a deal, son, but who did you have in mind as king? You? He smirked.
No, it would have to be someone the gnomes over the whole land could know and be inspired by. Shall we find Teak? He would be perfect.
The hero Teak? Can anyone find him? Besides, he has always fled from social positions before. How will we convince him? Queried Abercon.
Oh, we don't convince him, said Cilio. We cannot. We convince Little Flower.
That wild-haired, murderous Chinite wife of his? The general was wide-eyed.
She still has respect for General Randon, said Cilio.
So how do we get him to convince her? Get them both drunk? The general laughed.
Actually, we have his niece with us. I think we can get her to sit down with the Chinite gnome and pitch our idea for us, said Cilio.
What will she charge for this kind of suicide? Asked Abercon.
She's right here. Let's ask her. Cilio turned to Windy and asked, So what will it be, O killer of men? Will you sit with a killer gnome and tell her of my plan? Will you place it in a sunny spot so she can see it well? Clean off some of the blood and dirt for us.
Unaccustomed to gnomish methods of discussion, Windy was unsure if they were really asking her to speak with this Chinite gnome, or if the whole conversation was a jest. I can speak with her. I cannot say if she will listen, said Windy politely.
A perfectly postulated plan, said Abercon, standing. Let's see if we can lure the two of them out of seclusion and get Teak's wife aside to make our proposal.
Windy looked at Sard, and Sard looked back at Windy. She held up her hands in an uncomprehending gesture. Sard returned it. Neither was sure if they had been the target of a joke or if something historic was going on. Debrina looked at Smoke. Smoke winked at her, and she firmly ignored him along with the rest of the proceedings. Tennard shook his head and made some notes in his journal. Midgie just giggled and rebuilt the door lock she had gotten from someplace. An elderly and comprehensible female gnome offered to look after Midgie while they were gone. She also took charge of Wendy's parcel to keep it safe. Midgie was delighted, as the gnomes had many clever gadgets or toys for her to play with. The men were delighted because she had assembled all their equipment, and they had spent each morning reassembling it. Cilio told them this is what fuzzles always do, and one reason that gnomes are so adept at reconfiguring gadgets and repairing equipment. Smoke, Cilio, and Filio were provided with gnomish armor, a padded, lacquered armor of plant fibers, uniquely light and flexible. Gnomish swords, crossbows, shields, and helmets were also available. The sanctuary gnomes packed basket lunches for everyone and took baths. The gnomes further described the heroics of Wendy's Uncle Randon. Their hero Teak had fought beside him through adventures and battles that had immortalized them both. They related that her uncle was considered a hero in most of the kingdoms. In under King Valan, he was the official king's knighted champion. However, nobody felt that calling him Sir Randon was proper. He was famous as General Randon, and so he was thus called. Wendy was amazed at how different her uncle seemed as she found out more about his life outside of Tor. Would she ever get to meet him? The gnomes had put the word out somehow that they were going to engage in a huge adventure, with much treasure to be won and a gnomish company leading the way. Wendy could never discover how, but thousands of gnomes came to answer the call to adventure. Once they camped in the pastures of a widow named Emma, and by the following morning the army had more than doubled. They invited Emma and her children to join them for a breakfast of oatcakes and fried squash. Wendy showed Emma's children how to do twice as much farm work in half the time. There were gnomish slingers and crossbowmen. There were gnomish sappers and builders, gnomish hammer wielders, gnomish priests, and innumerable illusionists. They joined this strange gnomish army and marched to Corvel City. Long before they reached the outskirts of the city, they began to encounter large groups of undead. Some undead were sent from the city against them, but also many were drawn to the vampire's power. Many undead simply fled before the holy symbols of Debrina, Hefted, and the gnomish priest. Tanner's symbols proved to be especially effective. Many undead were more resistant, and they had to engage them with swords and gnomish hammers. The shadows were the worst. Their mind-numbing touch was cursed by all who felt it. By the time they reached a ruined signal tower on a hill overlooking Gorvel City, the army numbered at least 35,000 gnomes, about 2,000 dwarves who responded for their own reasons, and a few groups of men who owed the gnomes favors. Strictly a don't ask, don't tell topic. Sard and his men, Debrina, Smoke, Tennard, and Windy, found themselves in Cilio's command. It was an odd experience to be under the command of a gnome, especially a gnome like Cilio, but the gnomes proved to be effective even against the unliving horrors that turned out against them. Abercon had loaned Cilio a staff of well-seasoned lieutenants to help him with his responsibilities. Cilio, in his plume-topped helmet, could be found nearly always at the forefront of the fighting. In battle he was brave and effective, as well as completely unpredictable. Wendy found herself as part of a group of hammer gnomes and gnomish priests under the leadership of a gnome named Dobbin. Dobbin helped Wendy to get past the natural fear entering battle brought out in her. His words of advice and encouragement were invaluable. They worked well as a team, and Wendy found her respect for the gnomish people growing. The gnomes had found her a shield to use, but it was heavy and interfered with her style of fighting, so she left it. She kept her sword in motion and parried with her knife, and was very effective against the more corporeal members of the enemy. But she was defenseless against the ghosts, and especially against shadows, those rotted, soulless strips of darkness. General Aberkin and several divisions circled the city in daylight, close it in, and make certain that no undead reinforced the army of the vampire while preventing the undead forces from escaping. Small skirmishes lured groups of zombies, skeletons, and other daylight dead. Then, once the circle was well established and darkness fell, they built fires and lured out shadows, lesser vampires, and the spirits of the night. As weeks passed and the forces of the vampire diminished, they drew the circle closer around the city. Groups of gnomes continued to arrive. Once the fighting was inside the city walls, the undead were more vicious and powerful. The gnomes began to experience heavy losses for the first time. Windy was in the thick of the fighting, and Dobbin's group managed to reach the Lord's Square in the center of the city. Sard led a huge group of gnomes who found him to be a capable leader and were so effective that they took command of the old military quarter and anchored the gnomish forces. Smoke and a few gnomish thieves were busy scouting and gathering valuable information about the undead army. As his name implied, he seemed to appear and disappear without warning, like so much smoke. Tennard was providing magical fire where needed. Gnomish illusionists worked hard to dispel magical darkness and keep the battle well lit. The dwarves took longer to arrange themselves, but hit the enemy so hard that nothing with a corporeal body could resist them. Unlike most of the soldiers, the dwarves were clad in chainmail with metal plates, and few enemies could pierce it. The ground grew slippery with the remains of undead flesh. Unexpectedly, Dobbin's company found an entry into the dark and oppressive castle where the vampire lord had his lair. They were making their way up an obscure and unused back stair when Dobbin came upon the corpse of a fighting man holding a spear with a holy crux embedded in it. A gnomish priest verified that it was dedicated to good forces. Thinking that this blessed weapon might prove useful, Wendy picked it up and carried it along. The gnomish priest blessed the dead warrior and helped to dismember his corpse. This hero would not join the ranks of the cursed. They found their way further up the stair. The top of the stair opened into an alcove at the rear of the castle's great hall, now dark and forlorn seeming. Tables and benches lay in ruins here and there. The throne itself was just off to the right, and draped in shadow. As they sought to get their bearings, the dank smell of a tomb and numbing cold breeze blew over them. The huge shadowy figure of the vampire rose from the throne in the dark hall, turned and walked slowly and deliberately towards them. Dobbin yelled for the charge and ran forward, hammer at the ready. The vampire swept him aside with a disdainful gesture. The other gnomes shrank behind Windy, and although they were not cowards, the power of the vampire was draining their strength and sapping their resolve. Dobbin fell in a heap and did not move. The vampire began to tell them of what he had planned for them as revenge for their delaying his empire. Vile, detailed images of horror and torment froze Wendy's blood and prevented her from moving. Then one of the gnomes screamed and fell. The noise startled Wendy out of her stunned state, and for a moment she could think and move, and she heard George's words again. When you face an enemy who uses magic, silence them fast. A sword cannot deflect magic, but it might ruin a spell and gain you time. Against magic, you will need all the advantages you can get. Wasting no time, she dropped her sword and grabbed up the holy spear. She prayed to the one god to let her anger carry her on. Screaming at the vampire, she leapt forward and buried the spear up to the holy symbol through the vampire's chest. A flash of esoteric energy blasted Windy back on several feet, and from the vampire, a dizzying pattern of lights momentarily danced before her eyes, and she lost consciousness. When she again woke, an old dwarven priest had removed her vambraces and was applying an ointment to her right hand and arm. When Windy looked down at her arms, she could see a pattern like many lightning bolts burned into her right arm and hand, as well as parts of her left. As the feeling crept back, the pain threatened to make her pass out again. But with the dwarf's help, she got through it and could lie back and rest. Her breath felt raw and painful.
"You did it,"
a gnome enthused.
"We won! The city is free, and all the remaining dead things are fleeing."
"What happened to the vampire?" asked Wendy. "I only remember striking it with the old spear." She looked around, trying to orient herself.
"I don't know what that spear was," said another gnome in a subdued voice, "but as soon as you ran it into the vampire, all that shadow and cold and fear he brought with him stopped, and then he shrank back into a dried up old corpse and fell to ashes. The spear, unfortunately, also burned to ashes and is gone." He poked sadly at the pile of dark powder that had once been a vampire. "So all the dead forces are vanquished?" asked Wendy. "Well," said the old priest, "we don't know if they are vanquished, but they will not soon return here." He asked her to flex her shoulders and blink her eyes. "And before they come back," added another gnome, "we can have the city fortified against them." "General Abercon still has the outer guard standing against them. I think that few will escape," said the sad gnome by the ashes. "But we should fortify the city anyway. It's ours now." "Provided King Mathrin's as good as his word," injected the old priest. "Humans have a long history of promises broken and forgotten." He asked Wendy if she could feel her feet. "Where is Dobbin?" asked Wendy. The dwarf sighed and pointed sadly to a covered form nearby. "His neck was broken. There was nothing I could do," said the old dwarf. Wendy's hand went to her face in shock as she realized that she had lost her new friend. How many more would she lose? Just then Sard, Debrina, and Smoke came up the front stair and approached the gnomes and Wendy. "So it is true," said Debrina. "You conquered the great vampire. How?" Her eyes were bright with wonder. "Are you all right?" asked Smoke. His upper arm was bandaged. His right upper arm was bandaged. "We seem to have won the day," said Sard. "The city is empty of undead, and the gnomes are securing it." Wendy noticed that he was limping. A gnomish priest led Debrina away some distance where they were talking in whispers. The old dwarf priest and Smoke helped Wendy over to the steps of the dais, where she could sit comfortably. He gave her a healing tonic to drink and went looking for more injuries. A gnomish fighter fetched her sword to her. Taking stock of herself, Wendy discovered that both her knives were missing. She seemed to remember one breaking on a skeleton warrior. The other had been knocked out of her hand by an unseen foe. She would have to find replacements. One glove was missing, and her boots were badly in need of repair, but otherwise all was accounted for. Her feet ached, and a tub of hot water would be paradise. Just then Tonner, Bud, and Riff came up the stairs and congratulated Wendy. "I'd hoped one of the vampires I defeated would be the big one," said Tonner, "but they were all too weak to be the vampire lord." "We are so glad to see you alive and whole," said Bud. Riff just grinned at her like a happy puppy. "As soon as we are rested and resupplied," said Sard, "I think we had better return to our quest for Tonner's symbols and so get to Luffa and Prince Frederick. Summer is here, and the roads will be full of traders. If we can fall in with some of them, we can avoid robbers, goblins, and grolls." "Not yet," said Celio from the top of the main stair. "Teak is in the city, and Wendy promised to talk to Little Flower about our plan." He had gotten rid of his commander's hat and looked almost like the same gnome they had known before. "I can only tell her what I know," said Wendy. "How shall I meet her?" "I've arranged for her to come up and meet you," said Filio from the top of the back stair. "She's coming up now." "And Teak?" asked Cilio with a tone of urgency. "Is busy with the meeting of the commanders," said Filio, "and you are supposed to be there too." "What?" said Cilio. "You said that you would take point," said Filio. "Now they require you to be part of the military council." "I don't want to be part of any council," said Cilio. "This is the price of being a hero," said Filio. "You don't see me leading a charge against undead hordes or presenting earth-shaking plans to the gnomish people, do you?" "Brickle-nuts," said Cilio, and hurried off. "The rest of us should go also," said Filio. "It will allow for a nice girlish chat between these two."
girlish chat? Wondered Wendy to herself. As the gnomes and men walked over to the main stair, a female gnome with a wild shock of raven black hair and a sword on her back that looked far too big for her to wield came out of the back stair. She approached and Wendy stood to greet her. "I bid you greetings, Wendy, who slays men and vampires," she said with an unusual accent. "I am familiar with your honored uncle, and am pleased to finally meet you." She bowed with great formality. "I offer you my greetings and respect, Lady Little Flower, whom the gnomes of this land speak of with much respect," Wendy offered back. "I too am pleased to meet you." She tried to imitate the formal bow back to Little Flower. "I am told that your husband Teak is an honored hero as well, so we have much in common." "Oh, I think that this is more of what we have in common," said Little Flower. Losing the formal tone, she unslung and drew her oversized sword, and engaged in a series of impressive moves and poses. She resheathed her sword, and looked at Wendy expectantly. Sensing what she meant, Wendy drew her sword, and engaged in some of the moves that George had shown her, and a few that she had learned from fighting. Her arms were quite sore, but she managed to finish all the moves. As she resheathed her sword, she bowed on impulse, somehow sensing this was the thing to do. Little Flower giggled and said, "You are correct, Wendy. I forgot to bow. Please excuse the mistake." Wendy found herself liking the wild gnome, and the feeling seemed to be mutual. They talked about the hardships of living on an adventure, military men and how they were, and homesickness. "Oh, is wonderful," said Little Flower, "but I miss my home valley back in Chin. We had the best fishing and the most beautiful mountains ever, but I would not leave my husband for anything." Sensing an opening, Wendy inquired, "What if the gnomes made him their king, and he could rule from anywhere?" Little Flower looked hard at Wendy for a moment, and asked, "They asked you to convince me, did they not?" "Well, yes," admitted Wendy. "The gnomes think that Teak's honor and reputation will bind the gnomes together, so they might have a kingdom, if not a land, the beginning of the gnomes of Menodoc becoming a free people again." The two of them sat together on the dais. "I see the possibilities," said Little Flower. "What authority will he have?" "King Mathrin has sworn to treat him as a royal king, although for now the gnomes of Gorvel City must swear fealty to King Mathrin," said Wendy. "The gnomes hope that in time the kingdom of the gnomes will be thought of as equal to any other kingdom. But for now it is said that half a meat pie is better than no meat pie." "I suppose that makes sense," said Little Flower, looking thoughtful. "But Teak is not going to be happy having to appear at court. He hates such formality." "I can understand that," said Wendy. "I'd rather look after my own affairs than participate in the formalities at court. You can always refuse. I never said that I would talk you into it. I just said that I would tell you their plan. The decision is up to you and your husband." "I will think on this," said Little Flower, as she idly balanced the sword on the back of one hand. "The good of all the gnomish people of Menodoc is the issue." "I cannot advise you there," said Wendy. "I do not know what the gnomes know." "You are honest and honorable," said Little Flower. "We must remain friends." "I would like that," said Wendy. They had lost two of the original farm hands, named Grinder and Keel. Sard helped Sabrina say a few words over their graves. "Good men," said Sard simply. "I'll miss them." But his expression told of a more painful feeling of loss. They had eagerly followed him. He had accepted responsibility for them. Now they were gone. In the end, Teak accepted the crown, although with a lot of provisions to help keep him out of court as much as possible. He agreed that the gnomes deserved their chance to be a people again. More gnomes and Midgey arrived from the gnomish sanctuary for the ceremony. The coronation ceremony appeared to Windy, Debrina, Tennard, and Sard to be a riot of barely controlled chaos. But it was official. Teak the hero was now His Highness Teak, King of the Gnomes. Cilio managed to wiggle his way out of a council position and wanted to leave before General Aberkin sobered up. Windy was relieved to reclaim her parcel so she could continue her mission. Debrina approached them after things had quieted down enough for conversation. "I cannot tell you how much your friendship means to me," she said, "but I have received an opportunity to set out on an adventure of my own for a most noble purpose, and I simply cannot refuse. I hope to see you again, but I must leave tomorrow, so I will bid you farewell tonight." This announcement took the rest of the group by surprise. Windy hugged Debrina and shed a few tears. Sard and Tennard shook one hand warmly, while Smoke shook the other hand and slipped a few coins into her purse. Midgey stared uncomprehendingly. They offered each other blessings and best luck, while reminiscing about the time they had spent together. The next day, when they finally got free of gnomish farewells, Windy could not help thinking that even though their group was larger than it had been when they first started, they had lost a large portion of it. Sard reminded her that they would always be friends. Smoke put in that they would always have welcome in Gorvel City. Windy did feel very fond of the gnomes and their city. She still felt that way even after they had to go back and get their purses, which some young gnomes had taken. Smoke showed them a special way to lace up their coin purses to signal to other gnomes that these people were not to be robbed. Maybe. More from Arundel. From Ventura they headed north once again. I asked myself, is madness part of being human? Or are they aware of me and trying to throw me off the track? Then I see that the gnomes in the group are taking them to the last safe haven of the gnomes. Now I know they will die. So I reword my speech of justification to fit gnomish thinking, and they emerge intact once again. Throwing all my preconceptions to the flowing winds, I follow them to Gorvel City and the most powerful undead creature north of Bendrick Island, the vampire of Gorvel City. All right, now they are dead. Except they have every gnome in the region joining them in the first gnomish army to be seen in 1,000 years. They battled the undead hordes and won. Okay, I slew a few that ran my way. Once again, the girl and her group emerged intact and victorious. I asked a gnome foraging in the nearby woods what had happened. He says that they have helped establish a gnomish city and the return of a gnomish king. I scratch myself to see if I am awake. Am I at fault for being confused? They set off again westward. If they take the river south, I can breathe easy, knowing that they are finally heading south to Luffa. This is wishful thinking, I know.